Cindy Lou, are you with us, Cindy? I think I see you there.
Hi, yes, I'm trying to get my videos started, I think.
There you go. You missed the beginning of the show where I couldn't get my microphone working, so there you go.
The age of COVID technical issues.
Zoom burnout and all the rest of it. So, and I'm also welcoming Anna Celenza, our
Nice to
co-founder of
see
Music
you,
Policy
Anna.
Forum and host of today's Zoom. So, Cindy, we're so happy you're with us. And again, for our audience, what we've been really trying to do over the last 5 months is really showcase a whole range of perspectives across the whole music ecosystem, and really check in with people in terms of not only what are they doing now in response to the shutdown, but what were they doing before? Where do they kind of fit in this whole complicated Zynga tower or Jenga tower that we all live in? And Cindy, why don't I'm going to let you introduce yourself a little bit in terms of your day-to-day work with Park Avenue Artists, but we are thrilled to have you on representing a perspective we haven't had on the show really that much in terms of artist management.
Oh, thanks so much, Michael, for having me. And I'm really grateful to be able to have this space to talk through these issues. So like Michael mentioned, I work in artist management in New York City, though I'm not in the city right now. And the agency that I work at is called Park Avenue Artists, and we have a roster that's very wide-ranging in terms of talent. And we have been kind of navigating through these times in a really, I think, innovative and adaptive way. So I'm really grateful to our artists for kind of being able to pivot and being open-minded, and we kind of have followed suit. And really just learning more about this all the different aspects of this ecosystem that have allowed it to be what it has been in the past and how it can look in the future.
So just on a very basic level, how would you describe the role of a manager? Like, what does a manager do? Not, again, pre-COVID. So what was your year going to be like if we had to have this mess this year in terms of the shutdown?
Yeah, so managers are essentially kind of the ones who guide an artist's career trajectory, whether that's long-term or short-term, and sort of guide all of their business opportunities. So we kind of shepherd them through performance opportunities as well as recordings and brand collaborations, artistic collaborations, and really anything that they feel inclined to do artistically to really help them put their work out into the world. And I think in addition to that, we also have a very humanistic and personal role of recognizing them as emotional and full human beings, and they're not simply commodities in a system that tends to seek to commodify everything in our capitalist markets. So I think that's another very integral part of our work. And it's really also sometimes being a middle person between our colleagues in the presenting world, in the live venue world, and with our artists.
Yeah, something that we talk a bunch about at Music Policy Forum is the importance of a team, and the sort of historic arc that many artists went through a long time ago, around the turn of the century, when it became clear that digital tools were making it possible to do things that historically may not have been that easy to do. So you could build your own website, you could book your own tour, you could use email and other communications tools to manage relationships with venues. You could as social media evolved, you could be your own social media manager and all that. And then a lot of artists were finding, that was taking them off mission, because all the energy for a lot of people that they were putting into all those other competencies were taken away from their core job, which depending on the artist is, potentially composing or writing music, playing shows, making records, etc. But I think the other piece, which I'd love for you to speak to, is as the business has become more and more complicated, it's sort of exhausting to navigate, like, what choices can you make as an artist, and how do you put yourself in position to be viable economically? And where do you, again, what are the trade-offs? So can you speak a little bit about, and you touched on this, but go a little bit deeper in terms of the artists that you work with, like that mentoring aspect and that sort of feeling like we're on the same team, navigating what is often a complicated and sometimes a little bit of a toxic industry.
I'm really glad that you reminded me of that point. It's really the primary role of management, I believe, is to allow the artists to do what they do the best, which is be creative and really put out their art. And essentially, our primary role is to facilitate that. And in terms of, I guess, guiding them through as you said, at times very toxic or very overwhelming industry, I think it's really spending time to really get to know them on a more personal level, because when you get to know their preferences and their beliefs on whether certain opportunities are worth pursuing or not, you can sort of help better vet things that come their way or filter out a lot of, I guess, opportunities that, may or may not align with who they are or what they want to be or their artistic ethos in that sense. And in a way, a lot of management involves protection, I think, like sort of protecting the artist from, whether that's in a monetary sense, like protecting them from deals that undercut them or put them in a disadvantaged position. And also, I guess, protecting our colleagues in the presenting industry in terms of, advocating for what artists deserve and, I guess, as integral parts of this ecosystem, what they can contribute to that world. Yeah.
Yeah, and something I think is interesting about the artists that you work with, which is a little bit of a different shading in the conversations we've been having. We've talked a lot over the last couple of months about independent venues and rock clubs and places, that are presenting hip hop and things like that. And you tend to represent a clientele that has a little bit more of a mix in terms of nonprofit presenters, universities, sort of major institutional presenters like Kennedy Center, et cetera. And could you speak a little bit to that dynamic of working both in the kind of commercial marketplace and then it's not a non-com, it's a quasi-commercial marketplace, I guess, in terms of some of those other, government-sponsored or publicly funded presenters?
So definitely equate it with wearing many different hats. I think tone and communication is so important because, representing the same artist to different live presenting partners can look very different depending on, as you said, the size of that or nature of that presenter. And I think it's really about, as we take time to learn about the artist, we need to take also time to understand what our colleagues on the presenting side, what their goals are and how we can help them achieve them. And I think it's really about that balance that is at play no matter what the institution is, but it sort of takes on different flavors, if you will, depending on whether it's a university or a nonprofit or government funded or more commercial and kind of bigger scale. So I think it's very edifying for me, particularly to learn about all the different personalities that are at play and kind of what each entity ultimately wants and what they are kind of after.
Well, we're going to bring Anna Chunza in a minute and talk a little bit about 2022 and the future and the big reset and what we'd like this world to look like if we were making the decisions. But before we get to that, one of the reasons we're so excited to have you on is that you've been part of a really, really interesting organizing effort called PAMAC, the Performing Arts Managers and Agents Coalition, which basically emerged a couple months ago, not that long ago, basically out of a recognition that there was a perspective that really wasn't being kind of reflected in the existing advocacy infrastructure. Could you talk a little bit about PAMAC and what y'all are up to and how people can plug into that work?
Yeah, you give a great summary of what PAMAC is, but I am a member of it along with Charlotte Lee, who's my colleague, and she and my colleague David Lai have been working on advocacy efforts in terms of our group, our coalition. We have 250 plus independent artist management agencies and booking agencies as well as producers, but also really on behalf of the art sector as a whole in our country. We want to emphasize that this is an ecosystem, like we have been talking about, and that any one part really is coexisting in this kind of synergy with every other aspect. I think one thing that you saw in this domino effect of COVID on our arts industry is that when one part of it started to crumble, everything else it was an inevitability, like that they would follow suit. It was just a matter of when. And I think our coalition's efforts really hope to highlight that what we're advocating for in terms of our Senate to legislate for COVID-specific arts relief is really on behalf of not just musicians, not just management, not just independent producers or anything, but really like the entire ecosystem that's at play.
Yeah. So could you speak a little bit about how what has it meant to engage people? So if people are interested in engaging with your work, what are the tools that you're using? How do they, what would that be practically speaking? So if someone goes to the website that Alex put into the chat, what would they see, and what are you hoping people can do to intersect with your work?
So you might see a few things. Firstly, on the About page that is linked in the chat, you'll see what our appeal is to Congress. 3 points regarding the EIDL loans, PPP, and PUA. And these are kind of our top 3 that need to be addressed, hopefully, fingers crossed, in Congress. Because currently the unemployment benefits are set to expire, federal unemployment benefits are set to expire next week. And it's very clear that, this is not like a few months of crisis. This is a whole year for our industry. And there's no way that a lot of businesses that make up this sector are going to survive in any shape or form if we don't have federal support. So that's one thing you'll see. You'll also see a link to our change.org petition at the bottom, which also details a lot of our asks. Currently, I think we're at like 15,000 something signatures. It's been really great seeing a lot of solidarity and support expressed by not just members of our coalition, but a lot of their communities as well. And I think also if you hit the Take Action tab at the top, it takes you also to the petition. And I think there might be also a section to sign up for our mailing list. So that's actually where the most, targeted advocacy in terms of reaching out to your senators, reaching out to your representatives on the local and state level really lies, because we sort of send instructions via mailing list to our coalition with sample scripts or things that they can advocate for. And we also have broken down every single member's zip code, so you can write your representatives directly.
And I think there are a couple of things I'd like to lift up here. One is thank you and congratulations to you and Charlotte and everybody, who have come together to help put this effort together. I think I think there are 3 major takeaways from my standpoint. I think the first is, again, when we talk about the federal funding dynamic, and, for better or for worse, I've been around this stuff in DC for longer than I'd like to admit. And it's a challenge sometimes in the creative sector to get our head around the fact that that money is going to be spent. They are going to spend, likely between 1.5 and $2 trillion. And that money is going to be spent on those people who show up to make the argument about why they need to get resourced. And there's no shame in that process of letting your elected officials know this is the reality of what our situation is right now. And if you are investing resources or stimulus funding or relief funding, we need to be part of that conversation. And the worst thing they can do is say, we don't think you deserve money, but the downside of not engaging in that process is, again, that they're not going to just volunteer it and say, oh, great, let's put this money into the creative sector just for fun. They're just not going to do it. So one is, this whole notion of showing up is amazing. The second thing that you all have done, which is really impressive, is you basically scanned the advocacy ecosystem and you said, there's a perspective here that is not being represented, that we have a particular niche here as artist managers that is not necessarily being prioritized in the other institutional players, which doesn't mean they're doing a bad job. It just means they're focusing on their knitting. Like NEVA is focusing on independent venues. And so for y'all to start, and you started small, and then you got the word out to your network, and then you had 250 agencies on board within like a month. And that's really impressive because that gives you scale, and it gives you the opportunity to do targeted messaging to your community, which then helps them, resource them so they can feel like they're taking action. The third thing that you're doing, which I think is really impressive that I really want to hold up, is that then, you're not just out there saying, we need the, $15 million, targeted artist manager support fund. You're saying, where do we fit into the broader advocacy ecosystem? Say, okay, if we're bringing to bear this network of experts that have bandwidth and expertise and can help, how does that align with what other people are doing so we have strength in numbers? And I think it's a really important lesson that that your team, my sense is, that you've been very pragmatic and strategic in terms of how are you amplifying other efforts so we're all building together, and it's not just like a totally just, uncoordinated, just everybody just bouncing into walls. So I just think, for our viewers, I really encourage you to dig in, to what they're doing at PAMAC, to see if that's the organization that, if you are still looking for an organization to represent sort of where you fit in the community, that may well be a fit, but certainly, amplify what they're doing, pass the word along to, managers, musicians who are on today's meeting. If your manager is not involved, or if your agency that works with you is not involved in this effort, make sure it's on their radar screen. So anyway, that's a long speech, Cindy. I apologize for that. But I just think it really, I think it's really, we talk a lot in this program about, how 2020 is just such a disastrous bummer on every level, but there are things that we can really hold up and feel good about. And I think the sort of emergence of this activism, grassroots activism, and engagement with the policy process in the music sector has been something that we really are encouraged by. And it gets to the part, and Anna, I'd like to bring you in now, to think about the future. We think about this reset, and we think about this infrastructure and the power that we're building, and we all collectively understand the need to have better structures and different leadership and approach this stuff differently. And so, and I don't know if you have a question at this point, or
I do have a quick question, and I would, to kind of build off of what you just said about how it's a bummer year, and it's very easy to quickly go to the things that are the problems, but I'm wondering, have there been any revelations or things you've learned that you went, oh, actually, once we get through all this, this was a good lesson to learn, or this is something to think about my business in a new way? I wonder if there's anything like that for you, Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
Great question. Well, I guess nothing new really on the table, but just kind of things that have always existed and now we've sort of removed the veil from, so to speak, whether that's in terms of real community engagement. Like it cannot be just ending at outreach. That's just not good enough. And if anything, our society, we place monetary value on things that we value culturally. And, even when we didn't have a pandemic, it's not like the arts were quote unquote thriving, and it's not like they could not have benefited from federal support. So now it's sort of like all of these issues, like the way that the pandemic has disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities in the US, is like it's sort of just made all of this more amplified, and we can't look away anymore. I think that has been the sort of biggest realization that our industry is facing. And I think it sort of also shines a light on how there's so many processes and infrastructures that were not really serving our communities before, and now is the perfect time to really hone in on those and really change for the better, because if not now, then when are we going to do it?
Yeah, definitely. And your agency, by the way, you have an amazing list of folks that you represent. I went down the rabbit hole of watching all these videos and things today. So that's really wonderful. I would say in general, I saw sort of three big groups. So there are classical, like Joshua Bell, classical performers, and also Broadway performers, and then singer-songwriters. And I'm wondering, are you as a manager noticing differences of how sort of those three different segments of the performance ecosystem are dealing with the pandemic? And I'm thinking, unions with orchestras versus unions with, Broadway theaters. And I'm just curious if you've noticed any differences genre connected.
Wow, I love these questions you're asking. I think, well, on the classical side, it's kind of been this like wake-up call that there's so many ways that the classical world sometimes doesn't intersect with technology and doesn't intersect with streaming, and so much so that there have to be specific streaming services created for classical music, which personally I think is a little counterproductive. Like, maybe we should be advocating for everyone who's already on Spotify and on Apple Music to give them resources to better understand or approach classical. But that's sort of one thing that I've seen in that genre is like really just going all in terms of experimenting with live streaming, experimenting with how you really cannot replicate a live experience via the internet. So what can we do to innovate and to really create essentially what is a new form of consuming music? In terms of Broadway, I have really loved artists sort of doing duets or like calling on their followers of all ages to kind of sing along with them. And they have been also leading amazing advocacy efforts in terms of federal support. Like a few of our partners in our coalition are very involved in Broadway, like the Broadway League, as well as Extend PUA. And yeah, I guess in terms of maybe like the pop and R&B world, it's I think because that is a very also already digital and like streaming heavy genre and market, it's been more about kind of how we can leverage that existing relationship and I guess developing that even more.
Great, thanks.
So Cynthia, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to just unpack this a tiny bit more. One of the things that we're really interested in is this sort of generational handoff of power. And this notion that an industry which is increasingly digital, a lot of the decision making, happens, really comes through a lens of analog natives who, grew up and sort of internalized a music industry that is fundamentally bears little resemblance to not only the industry of today, but the industry of the future. And I would just love and I don't mean like, I hope this doesn't sound patronizing, but I think it's just really interesting that, you're fairly young. You've been out there for a while, but you're a young person with, showing a lot of leadership and a lot of vision in this community. And again, coming into the community with a fundamentally different relationship to technology, essentially as a digital native. You grew up with a different relationship to a digital music community that again would be very different than my generation would have. And I'm just curious about how are you seeing those generational dynamics taking place, especially at a leadership level in terms of like who really is making decisions about these future structures and what does that look like? And is that something that you think you're optimistic about, or are you feeling like that's just still going to be a structural challenge, in terms of what's happened over the course of the music industry over time?
Another really great question. Well, this is something that I think about in my own work as well, is, as you were saying, this tension between those who are decision makers in our industry and who have extensive experience and expertise, and we really look up to them, versus it being a fundamentally cultural industry that demands relevance and it demands innovation and adaptation. And I do feel very fortunate that I have had the opportunity to work with leaders in our industry who are very open-minded, and they're not coming from like a castle in the sky kind of mindset. So I think maybe specifically for classical, this applies more, but kind of shedding this mindset of preservation and protection in the face of creativity and innovation. Mm-hmm. I think those two things are not mutually exclusive. I find it very fascinating how history is so cyclical, in the sense that we now are like this preservation at all costs, like Beethoven must be always Beethoven forever. And it's like, well, it's not like when Beethoven first premiered his works that everybody loved them across the world, right? Like, I think it took time for us to lionize artists like that, and the same way that we continue to do so today. And I think just keeping in mind that this is a fundamentally fluid industry, and that's what makes it so great and what makes it so fascinating to be a part of. And I think also just understanding that this can be a very toxic and competitive industry, but ultimately, like, we're here because we love music. We're not here because we want to like just like wage culture wars all the time and like cancel people. Like, I think it also speaks to our larger like political discourse as a country, but we need to learn how to not see things as immediately black and white, and kind of really approaching each person as a valid opinion that they hold, and kind of comparing what we think to that, instead of just, everything that someone says that I don't agree with is automatically just canceled, and I don't like that or something.
Great answer. That's a great answer. Well, and that's a great way to close out today's program, I think. So, Cindy, we so appreciate you joining us, and congratulations for all your work at PAMAC. Again, everybody should check it out at artsrelief.org. And Anna, thank you as always for joining us. We love your
pleasure. I always love these shows.
Nick Forster, Danny Grant, thank you so much for joining us earlier today. Our producer, Alex Dolvin, always making things go smoothly. Oh, Danny's got a doggy. As always, this show will go up on YouTube over the weekend, and we'll share the link. Please feel free to distribute it to friends and colleagues that you think would find this interesting. We'll be back next Friday with our program, and then we're going to take a couple weeks off in August and recharge and think about new things to talk about. But thanks to everybody. Hit us up as always with questions, comments, ideas, musicpolicyforum@gmail.org. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your Friday.